together our basic dough for this cinnamon roll, and that's going to require about 4 cups of flour, and we're using AP flour. AP flour has no leavening agent in it. That's why we have the yeast, which we bloomed earlier. We have about 1/3 cup of shortening and butter. I like to use a little mix, so you get a little bit of that butter flavor, but you get that soft texture from the shortening. We have 1/4 cup of sugar, and we're going to use 1 egg, and about 1/2 teaspoon of salt will be added as well. So I'm using my mixer to put all this together with the dough hook attachment. If you don't have this, it's not the end of the world. You can easily mix this in a bowl, but we are going to use the mixer for kneading our dough. It's just time saver for me, but if you don't know how to do that, I'll make sure I put a link in for how to hand knead dough for a yeast bread. Make sure that you check the links for blooming yeast and for scalding milk. These are B2 elements that are used in this recipe, and if you don't know how to do that yet, you can just check the links and follow those instructions there. Okay, we're going to start with a couple of things. We're going to mix all our wet, and that includes our pre-scalded milk. That's going to include our sugar, our butter, and our salt. And I'm going to tell you a trick. We're going to add our egg, but I always like to add my egg crack it into a separate container and then add it. Once you start mixing a bunch of ingredients, if you drop shell in, it's much harder to fish out, where if I crack it into a bowl and I end up getting shell in it, which is actually good luck, it's a lot easier to fish out. Alright, we're going to add that in, and I give that a quick little just mix around so that as I add the flour, it's not all just sitting on top. So we're going to add 2 cups of our flour mix. To kind of get this process going. And that wonderfully bloomed yeast that now has quite a nice head on it, we're going to add that in. And a rubber spatula is handy for being able to clean out everything, because we want all of that in there. All right. Now, sometimes it's easier to use your spatula to kind of get this wet stuff all pulled together, because a dough hook is really made to grab and fold the dough. It's not the greatest at mixing. So I'm going to give that just a little bit of a stir to kind of incorporate it all. Okay, we're going to leave this to kind of pull everything in. And then we'll see if we need to add the rest of our flour or if we're kind of in a good place. As the dough hook spins, you'll see that it starts to pull more and more in, and it will either start to get to a dry ball form where it's kind of moving around this ball, or else it'll kind of still be smearing wet. If it's still smearing wet, that's when you're going to want to keep kind of spooning just a little bit of flour in and kind of let it go a couple of turns until it kind of pulls everything together. And it's not bad to stop every so often and kind of scrape your sides, because the dry ingredients, especially in these with the center attachment, they like to kind of hug the sides of the bowl. Okay. As you can tell, looking in the bowl, we're starting to become more of a dough formation instead of a bunch of loose ingredients. It's starting to kind of pull together. Still looking a little wet to me, so I'm probably going to add about a tablespoon of our flour. But it's going to pull together and become more of a dough ball. The kneading process is used to pull together and stretch the fibers of the dough. And as it gets worked, it'll become more elastic and more elastic, which allows for that beautiful rising, that soft, tender texture we get in yeast breads. And that's what we're going for. We're trying to get it to that state of really loose, elastic, so that it can rise really big and full, and you can get that really soft, tender taste. We're going to cover this and stick it in a warm place and let it sit for about an hour. Hopefully it's going to double. What you're mainly looking to do when you cover it and put it in a warm place is you just want it to be away from a draft. If your oven is off, you can actually stick it inside your oven. There's no draft in there. If you have a warm spot in the sun that you want to sit it, that'll be fine. But what we're looking for is for the dough to double in size, and it's going to get that wonderful smell going. The yeast should bloom even further, and this should basically fill my bowl. So we're going to let that sit for the next hour and see what happens. While our cinnamon roll dough is rising, we're going to go ahead and mix up the other things we need to complete these cinnamon rolls. We're going to make a cinnamon sugar filling that will go in where we roll it up. And then we're also going to make an icing. It's going to be a cream cheese icing that we'll put on top of our cinnamon rolls when they come out of the oven. So, we're going to start with our little icing, and we're going to work with soft butter and soft cream cheese. That way we don't have to work so hard to kind of get all the flavors incorporated. We're using about 2 ounces of cream cheese and about 1/3 of a cup of butter. There we go. And soft just allows us to incorporate the sugar easier. Okay. We are going to add a teaspoon of lemon juice, and that just helps give everything a really nice bright flavor. Half a teaspoon of vanilla. And about a cup of powdered sugar. Cup of powdered sugar. Okay. Now we're going to mix this up, and the rubber spatula will work, or a whisk. I will tell you this, if you use a whisk, it's going to end up getting all in your whisk blades, and it's kind of a bit of a mess. So my suggestion would be a rubber spatula. Just kind of stir this together and incorporate the sugar. Okay. Since our butter and cream cheese are soft, you just kind of little smear and stir. Now, if it's coming out a little dry, we can add a little bit of milk to kind of soften the rest of it and kind of get everything incorporated. I wouldn't add a whole lot of milk, like a tablespoon at a time, because we don't want this to end up so liquidy that it doesn't stay on the cinnamon roll. We want to be able to kind of smear it on, more like a spread and less like a pouring syrup. You see? We've got a more like an icing consistency, less like a syrup. Okay. Give it a little taste to make sure we're good. Tastes good to me. And that's it for the glaze. Okay, now we're gonna mix up our cinnamon sugar filling, and it's gonna start with about 3/4 of a cup of white sugar, and we're gonna use 2 tablespoons of cinnamon. This is what we'll use when we are filling the dough before we roll it up. Give that a little stir. And we're going to go ahead and melt the butter that we will brush on our dough before we lay down this cinnamon sugar mix. And that's all there is to that. You can always add nuts if you want to add pecans or walnuts as a variation. But today we're simply making it with just cinnamon and sugar. So, in order to get ready for our cinnamon rolls that we're going to put together here in a sec, I'm going to go ahead and prepare my pan. I've picked just a 9x13, nothing special pan. But what we are going to do is we're going to coat the bottom with butter and then sprinkle it with some sugar so you get that wonderful caramelized bottom on these cinnamon rolls. It'll taste amazing, and it just adds a little extra zhuzh to your cinnamon rolls. So we're just going to take a little bit of this and sprinkle it over the bottom. And when we finish putting our cinnamon rolls together, they'll just sit right on top of this. See, nothing special, just gives it, like I said, it'll make the bottom a little kind of caramelly crusted almost. Okay, so we're gonna set that to the side, and we're gonna go ahead and put together our dough. I've already got my cinnamon sugar I mixed up earlier, and this is the butter. This is a stick of butter, which is a 1/2 cup of butter, and I went ahead and melted it in my microwave. It doesn't take but 20-30 seconds. Give it a good stir. That's all there is to it. Now I'm using a silicone pastry brush, but you may have a regular bristle brush. If you don't have either of these, you can use the back of a spoon. It doesn't have to be a fancy option, but what you're basically going to do is once we roll out the dough, you want to be able to spread the butter around. Back of a spoon, pastry brush, whatever works for you. Okay, here's our dough we've been letting rise. Now mine's not looking as puffy as I would have liked, but we're going to give it a whirl. Worst case scenario, they'll just won't be as fluffy as I had hoped. So we're going to give that a bit of a squish, and then we're going to flatten it out. Now, with cinnamon rolls, you're going to flatten it out like you would a piece, like in the shape of a rectangle, because we'll layer everything and then roll it up, and then we'll slice it. Your best bet on being able to do that is to kind of start with a square or a rectangle shape to begin with. So I'll grab my rolling pin. We're going to roll it out as even as we can. We're going to roll that out to about a 15 by 9. So a little bigger than the bottom of your pan, which is a 13 by 9. So about the size of the top of your pan. With rolling pins, you may have a traditional or a less traditional version. This is a French rolling pin. There are no moving parts. It's just a dowel that's tapered at the ends. This is a traditional, and this is generally what you'll find in the store. It usually has bearings in it that'll allow it to roll. Either will do fine. All we're looking for is a rough 9 by 15 and as even as you can get it, so that as you roll your cinnamon roll up, you have an even swirl of dough and cinnamon and sugar. Now I prefer my French one just because I like the way it works. And I try to keep that rectangular shape the whole time I'm working on it, so that I don't end up having to do a whole lot of change to the overall shape. So as you roll it a little and you work it a little bit, kind of keep working your shape rectangular. I usually like to kind of unstick it from my countertop before I go putting the butter and the cinnamon sugar on it, because they have a tendency to kind of glue themselves down. Move this stuff so you can see what I'm doing. So I just kind of peel it up to make sure we're not too cemented to my countertop. So we're going to coat this with our melted butter. And I try not to work right to the edge, because if you work right to the edge, it kind of gets sloppy and it doesn't hold together real well. So I go about a 1/2 inch from the edge and coat butter in everywhere else. Now once we lay down this butter, we're going to sprinkle our sugar cinnamon mix right on top. And I lay it on pretty thick because I like that flavor. So we'll sprinkle this on. And this, again, you're going to want pretty thick, because once it starts to bake, that sugar will become almost like a liquid instead of the crystals. And we want to make sure we get enough in there to kind of gooey it all up. And as the butter starts to kind of get absorbed into your cinnamon sugar mix, you'll see you can add more. Now this may get a little bit messy, but nothing good ever came from a clean area. You'll start on one edge or the other, and we're going to roll it the long way. And I think I'm going to start here. So I'm going to carry the cinnamon sugar more to the edge, because that's going to be on the inside edge anyway. And I try to roll this pretty tight. Not going to get crazy about it, but we want this to be tight enough that when we cut our rolls in a little while, hopefully it's pretty even. Generally, I just kind of push down a little bit on the seam in an effort to we're not looking to seal it like you would a loaf of bread when you're making a loaf of bread, but we do kind of want it to hold so that as we slice it into our cinnamon rolls, it's not just flopping out everywhere. Now, this takes a really good sharp knife to cut these. And in theory, you're going to get 12 to 15 depending on how thin you rolled your dough out to. And I'm going to shoot for 12. So I'm going to cut it in half and then cut them into 6. But a good sharp blade will cut right through that dough, and you get that beautiful swirl. That beautiful swirl that we're expecting and looking for. So we'll go ahead and cut it into 6 slices, and we can go ahead and lay those in the pan. And I go ahead and snug these up together, because them pushing against each other as they rise helps them kind of push up even more. So don't worry, there will always be one that looks a little pitiful because it's the end. Okay, so we'll tuck that in. I'll go ahead and cut this down into 6 more. Now we're going to let these rise a second time, which allows them to get that final lovely big poofy finish we're looking for. And that only needs to sit for about 30-40 minutes. But I'll go ahead and wrap them. I'll put some plastic wrap over. But look at that, we got our pretty swirls. So we'll put a wrap over it, and we'll let it sit again in that warm place where it's free from a draft, and let them sit about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll pop them in the oven and have baked yummy. I'm going to go ahead and cut my oven on while my bread is rising. Not only does that give it a warm spot to be sitting, but that way my oven can go ahead and preheat for the bake. So we have let our rolled cinnamon rolls rise, and as you see, they've gotten nice and puffy. So we're going to go ahead and throw these bad boys in the oven, which we preheated earlier to 350, and a little extra butter before I throw them in the oven, and that'll just get a nice coating on each top before it goes in the oven. Now these will bake for 20 to 30 minutes until everything's all golden and puffy. You let them cool just a little bit before you put the icing on so that it doesn't all just melt away. But this will give us a nice golden buttery top, and then to just give that flavor, yummy flavor. And so just kind of check on them every 2 to 3 minutes until they're golden and perfectly golden crisp on top. About 35-40 minutes. We're gonna go ahead and pull them out. Nice golden tops. Hopefully they'll taste amazing. We're gonna let them cool off for a few minutes, and then we'll smother them with goo. The warmth of the cinnamon rolls will help melt that icing and just give it that wonderful glaze on top. And of course, we're going to want to test one. See that yummy, sugary bottom? That's what putting that sugar in the pan, and that butter in the pan did for them. And I like a little extra, so. Ready to enjoy. Thank you for joining us, and I hope yours come out just as tasty as mine. Mmm.